Right, welcome everyone. It's 3 o'clock on the dot in the UK, so in the afternoon, of course. And we've just opened the doors, so everyone's turning up. So welcome to today's Ask the Analyst session. It's our first one of the year. I'll do the formal introductions and all the formal bits in a minute. We'll let everyone get comfortable, get yourself a cup of tea or whatever it might be, in maybe some Coke and lime. I've just found out that one of our panelists has a glass of that next to them. So yes, we'll just let some people come in. While everyone's arriving, I'll just say that we'll just use the chat. So if you'd like to ask any questions, my colleague Jack is there to help, and we will be doing questions and conversation there. And also, while we wait for the next couple of minutes, just tell us where you are. We've got David, our CEO. He's in the Cotswolds. I'm not far away in Bath. And Fiona, you're representing the Northwest. Wow. Jennifer, welcome. I think you may have got the award for the furthest away over in the US. Oh, welcome. We've got Tex at Fort Worth, and now my geography's like being very challenged very quickly.
That's Seattle.
Yes. So at this point, I'll quickly skip to the fact that Ricardo's from Spain. Great. So we've got quite a serious US contingent today. Hove, well, sunny Hove. So Mycelium, Costa Rica, Vanessa, fantastic. And Stefan, welcome from the River Rhine in Germany. Sweden, Anna. Wow, we have got a Alexander from Munich. This is a very, very international audience this afternoon, so thank you. That means we are crossing many time zones. So I'm just hoping that you're all sitting comfortably, you're all awake and ready to go. So I think we'll get going. I think probably some more people coming, but we like to keep this to 1 hour. So I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Martin Cousins, Head of Content at Fosway Group, and this afternoon we are looking at our 9-grid for learning systems, and this is our Ask the Analyst session. So we will talk a bit about ourselves, the research process, and then we will get into the grid, and then we will take questions. So it's mostly your questions. So if you've got any, please, as we go through, please do put them in the chat and we'll pick up on them a bit later. So I'd like to welcome David Wilson, Fosway's CEO, and Fiona Leteney, our Senior Analyst, who's also the lead analyst on this 9-grid. For those of you who don't know us, we are now well over 25 years old. I think it's safe to say. Founded in '96, we are Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, and we spend our time researching next-gen HR talent and learning. And the 9 grids are just one part of what we do, but they're a really important part of what we do. So the learning systems 9-grid is now, I think it's 11th iteration, we were saying just before we started. So this is a very in-depth process that takes months of pulling together. And we also provide and have been providing analyst services to corporates across Europe. And as I said, a lot of independent vendor research and market commentary. So Ian, if you could. So I've done the introductions. So there we go. You can spot the difference between the pictures and the real life. And just a quick overview of the session. As I said, we'll do everything in chat, please. So post your questions there. We will have people from various vendors on this session. So do play nicely, and we like it if you can say where you're, what company you represent if you are a vendor. So do that if you can and you're prepared to. And I'm going to hand over to David just to talk through the research, but we will be recording this session, so we will make this available to everyone. So all I would do is ask you to think about your questions as we go through, and we'll come back to them very shortly. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Martin, and good afternoon to everybody from me as well. I know some of you have attended these before, but if you haven't, always welcome on them. And obviously our aim on these sessions is really to have some time to try and answer some of your questions directly, or as directly as we can within there, and really just try and give a bit more context and detail around the 9 grids, etc. as well. I always try and start this with a few slides, just give a context around the research process, because I know a lot of you see the 9 grids outcome, the images, and hopefully some of you read the reports as well. But I mean, actually understanding what goes on behind them is really, really important. Each of the 9 grids is a really, really long kind of process. Each of them, we currently run 5 now, and each is a monster really in terms of the process. It absorbs a huge amount of time and resource. Creating a new 9 grid from scratch is a minimum 3-year process. And in the case of learning systems, as I said, we've had public 9 grids since 2013. So this is actually our 11th iteration of it, and we've had private versions prior to that as well. So it's a really long process, but each year we zero base it. This is really, really important to understand. I think sometimes the vendors, when they look at their position in the 9 grid, they don't really understand just how much every year we rebuild this completely from scratch. We modify the functional frameworks, we regather information from around the solutions, we do lots of briefings, we do loads of customers referencing and so on. The dominant view really that shapes our end analysis is ultimately what customers say. So what our corporate research network, which is typically mid and large enterprise organizations, and the corporate inquiries and advisory work that we do, plus obviously all the customer referencing process around it. That's really is a very dominant part of the decision process. We of course do loads of independent vendor briefings. We also do a very extensive functional capture process with hundreds of line items each year, and then we zero base the analysis of that. So we recalculate it, what market averages and what relative trajectories are and all this kind of stuff. So it's a very long process. There's a lot of effort in it. It goes all year round. And then there is this massive peak activity that goes on around leading up to the actual 9 grid cycle, which pretty much large is 4 to 5 months. Oops. So the inclusion criteria, one of the things we get asked a lot is who goes on it. And in simple terms, it's really based on relevance to our target buyer audience. So when we look at particularly across our corporate research network and similar organizations, who is it they're using already? Who are they actively considering? Especially if they're in a buying process, but also, who are the ones they're aware of looking at future things. And then also, we also look for innovator companies, startups and new companies that we think have the potential to achieve those 2 things. It is weighted towards an EMEA enterprise or an international company. Many of these are multinational typically, but it is weighted towards an EMEA and international company, not a US-centric one, for example, US domestic company. You can't buy your way onto a 9 grid, so there is no pay for play. No vendor can buy their way onto 9 grid, but they also can't buy their way off it either. So we include who we see as relevant, not necessarily based on the vendor complicity around that whole process as well. As we've said, in this case, it's kind of 11 years old, I think. So it's been going for quite a long time. The other, as I said, really, the primary analysis is really weighted towards what customers say, the corporate view. This isn't about filling in a vendor spreadsheet and then that calibrating something directly without any assessment of it or qualification of it and so on. It's very much driven by corporate view. We do a lot of in-depth vendor assessment, and we have a huge amount of data behind this. If any of you have worked with us on for example, on the corporate side of things, you'll kind of just know how much data we've got behind this. But ultimately that's used as an input, not as the dominant decision process, etc. And we obviously independently assess it. So we watch it if people are trying to game a system in terms of their submissions and so on, etc. We can easily remove that kind of bias in the process. So overall we've got huge amounts of customer insight, hard data, hundreds of thousands really of line item of information, particularly when you look at it over time. And we zero-base the analysis each year. Final thing is ultimately everybody I know is aware of the 9-grid and the 9-grid image, but the thing we would always say is read the report. It's much more than a diagram. We talk a lot around key trends in the market, which changes the way that we assess the vendors, as well as obviously the functional models we're using. We also, of course, provide information around the 9-grid itself and what makes it up and the different dimensions of the 9-grid. So again, to get context around a specific one, please read the reports. That makes a big difference, etc. And it will give you a lot more insight on what you're trying to do. Obviously, we would also strongly suggest to corporates who are using these seriously to also engage with us as well and actually get advice and support from us around their process as well, where that's appropriate. So Fiona, do you want to talk a bit more about the functional model, and then obviously let's go into the 9-grid itself?
So we have, as you can see here from the diagram, 5 main sections, which are then split down into either 4, 5 or 6 different subsections, and then under each of these subsections there could be anywhere between sort of 15 to 40 questions that we ask the vendors to tell us about what their capabilities are within that under that section. So this was changed a couple of years ago, following us doing quite a significant amount of research on specialisms. But each year we did a little bit of extra work on a couple of areas last summer, and then that changed the questioning this year as well. So yeah, we developed this. It goes on as the market changes, as the capabilities within the learning systems change, and we need to hone in on who's doing what. Anything else you want me to say, David, on that?
No, let's
okay.
get the 9-grid up and we can see what questions we get.
All right. So as you can see, there are some headlines there from the on the right side, and the first one being that the market is bracing itself for recession. But I just want to highlight that actually the good news is we see a lot of evidence of growth in the market. However, some of particularly the larger vendors are just maybe changing the sizes of the employees. They're maybe having to reduce costs as they look forward, and so they are bracing themselves for that recession. But we see that's happening maybe at the larger end. There was one of the larger corporate vendors did that sort of the middle of last year. We're hearing more and more that those reductions in headcount are happening, but we're also seeing a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and we talk about the war for talent. So we're seeing, and again, this was something that was mentioned last year in the report, that developers are few and far between, that there is some developers will be moving from smaller vendors to the larger vendors, but then you have some of the vendors that are buying out whole companies because they need, as part of the reason is they need that talent because of their roadmap. And I think it can be, we expect to see quite a lot more of the mergers and acquisitions going forward. And in a way, that's a good thing, because it means that everybody's working together then to actually increase that innovation. Because if everybody's competing against one another, then we don't get to move forward as people just kind of start up a new company. Skills is also at the core, And again, all the analysts have been talking about this for the last couple of years, and it's still a focus moving forward into 2023. I think from a learning perspective, we need to, call out the fact that all this conversation about skills, it's in learning where the upskilling and the reskilling is going to happen. From a learning systems perspective, it's important that the data is passed around an ecosystem so that wherever the skills engine is, or whether they're storing that data in an HR system, that the upskilling and reskilling data is actually passed back to that to kind of give the learner the credit for it. And that's not as easy as it sounds. Passing that data around a system has been a focus for quite a lot of the vendors over recent years. So we've also called out there that the frontline workers are not a new market area, but it's certainly up and coming. And we've seen this perhaps in the past, where for online learning, it's the desk worker that has had access through their laptops to that, and the frontline worker who doesn't have access necessarily to a desktop misses out on some of that content. What we saw during the pandemic was so much of a need to get either communications or learning to those frontline workers because of process changes, because of product changes, that has increased significantly. And it is some of the mobile bring your own device policies have been relaxed a little bit, so that it's made it happen. So where you'd see that on the grid would be more at the lower end of the potential, so that lower band, because there's not necessarily a sophistication requirement for all the functionality at that frontline level. So it's the hospitality, the retail, and so we've got quite a few. Certainly last year we had entrants at that level, and we're still seeing quite a lot of competition now building up for that frontline worker. In addition to that, another area that really kind of was it accelerated after the pandemic, or during the pandemic even, was the extended enterprise. So what we mean by that is customer and partner education. The buyer doesn't necessarily know that's what they are, but it's where you're talking about not the employees, but your customers, your partners who are selling your products and need training on those products. It could also include franchisees. It can include contractors. It's those that aren't the employees. And so that has increased, because in the past, what happened was that training happened in the classroom, and obviously it had to go online during the pandemic. And so there are a lot of the suites on the grid are capable to a greater or lesser extent of actually delivering that extended enterprise. And it depends on how mature you are as a buyer in terms of what you want, what the capabilities are that you need from a learning system. Would depend which of the vendors you would go for, up to the point of a specialist that we have on the grid in Thought Industries, that they are a specialist. They only do that external work, and they went onto the grid last year for the first time. They now have feet in the ground in Europe. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes ahead. And last but not least, the march on AI. So over the years, we've seen how the kind of Netflix style recommendations have been popular, and it's almost a sort of bit of a tick box that a lot of the vendors are expected to provide that. It's not necessarily the place where the most impacts can be made. And what we're now starting to see are areas. So for example, a lot of there's talk about adaptive learning. We've got some adaptive specialists on the grid, and that is using the AI and the algorithms, but also there's quite a lot in the starting to use it for content creation. So I know one of the one of the suites, so Docebo has an authoring tool that is very AI centric. We've also added Sana onto the grid this year, who Sana Labs, again, they are using something that is similar to the ChatGPT technology to actually create content. So it's going to be interesting over the coming years to see how AI, when it's focused, when it's on a specific area, how that's actually going to change the landscape and the way that we actually work. So I think the other thing to say, just to reiterate as well about what David's already mentioned, we zero base the grid. And this year, I mean, over the last few years, we've actually changed the dimensions of the grid to be able to fit more of the vendors on. As we start to get onto our radar, so many more vendors. And one of the things that we've been doing over the last few years is going out, because it's a European focus that we have. Sven, who's our German analyst, brought to me, these are ones you need to look for in Germany. Claire Marie joined us last year, and in France, she pointed out a number there. So, for example, we've got right in the centre there, Cifidis, and also BDs just slightly to the left. They're new French vendors that have gone onto the grid. Avendu also is a new German vendor that has gone, and there are a number of other vendors on there from these countries and others. There's quite a range across Europe and from the States, obviously, who have customers in the Europe. That's the aim. Is they can be working at, there can be vendors in the States that don't have customers that are actually headquartered here. So so that's important to remember. But the other another new entrant onto the grid was Microsoft, and for Microsoft Viva Learning, we couldn't not consider them, and we've had input from them, and we see that they are kind of moving in that in the right direction. But there is still some work to do, still some we need to sort of have a look in deeper at some of the customer case studies and whatever, but we've put them on the grid, as we sometimes do, in that potential leader box as a, watch out, the rest of the market, these guys are on the way. What I didn't say was that when we did that zero basing, and we had to change the criteria this year, over the years we've increased the size or made things smaller to get more on. This time we've had to change the criteria, and we lost a number of really good systems because they didn't quite meet the criteria this year. And it's not that we don't rate them, it's just that they were either smaller or in some cases they were acquired by another vendor, like Cornerstone took in Eggcast, and SumTotal, 360 Learning took Loop. So there were quite a few that had to go to allow us to fit these new entrants onto of which there were 9 onto this new grid. Any things you want to pick up, David? I think one of the other things sorry, don't often get the chance to kind of talk and not let the boss override me, so I will now. But on the strategic leader and above that top line, so this is something that because we had Cornerstone acquire Eggcast and SumTotal, it's now beginning to look quite not thin, but there are fewer systems that are capable, in our view, of that top band, and it's because their focus area needs to be complex, sophisticated, global, mature organizations, and the ability to support that. What we did do was recognize IMC, so they moved up from core leader into the strategic challenger, and we've also moved Degreed from strategic challenger into strategic leader. And because what we see, particularly as they are specialists, so they are narrower in terms of the functionality, but they, if there was a grid just for what they do in the same way for training orchestra, then they would be the strategic leader for that grid, even though they don't necessarily have the broadest functionality. So that's the difference that there is between the suites and the specialists. Okay, David, I'll let you speak now.
I mean, I was just going to cover off that as well. I think it's really interesting. All of our 9 grids continue to get busier, but in reality, the top band still is quite hard for organizations, for vendors to really step up into that, because of their need to be able to really serve the need of global companies really well. I think the switch of Degreed into strategic leader is a big step, and obviously Cornerstone with their TXP positioning now, and the addition of Edcast, and the way that they're basically, I think, enabled that architecture to be available to all of the real estates, including some Total and Saba customers out there, I think is really interesting. There's also some movement around core leader, and as Fiona said, obviously some interesting new additions into the core challenger, etc. So the mid band is still really crowded, etc. In terms of where we're going. So my suggestion is that we go into questions, Martin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, indeed. We've got some great questions. So thanks everyone for sharing those. I think where should we start? Jörg, I think he's asking a question around AI. So it's using ChatGPT and its likes to create company-specific questions might be risky, as you would need to feed it with classified content which is internal use only. So is that risky? What are the risks as we march onwards into the use of AI across everything that we do?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really good point. And I think there are also a lot of questions. Obviously, we know things like ChatGPT have got a massive profile at the moment within mainstream media. And obviously with Google announcing its Bard platform, somewhat maybe a little bit earlier than it probably should have done, given the impact on its valuation. But and obviously you're going to just see more and more happening here. And it's kind of interesting. Fiona talked about the war for talent and the vendors using M&A as a strategy. I mean, one of the big areas that obviously that applies to is AI. I think coming back, the whole way in which AI plays, I mean, we look at this extensively within the obviously HR and talent areas as well, and in recruiting. And it's pretty clear that it is starting to infect many of the processes. And but I think there are some challenges around that, especially using public services for providing them access to confidential client only, specific client data. I think that's a really huge issue that Jörg has highlighted. Plus also, the whole focus around ethical and explainable, right? So that's also another interesting challenge around what biases are built into it, and how that maybe kind of skews answers, etc. So I think the reality is there's a huge potential to use some of this technology to accelerate things like content curation and aggregation, and even content creation internally in an organization. But how that's done in a way that using what are effectively public services, etc., I think is a little bit more questionable. But at the end of the day, the horse is only just started bolting, and it's going to just keep getting faster and faster. So I expect, I think, to see this impact. I mean, it doesn't mean to say obviously that corporates yet understand how they engage. I mean, this is one of the challenges within all this innovation that happens in learning technology. There's huge amount is, sometimes the vendors are ahead on roadmap of where the corporates are in terms of adoption. And so that is also the other challenge, is understanding, what do you want to switch on and how. And there is kind of nervousness obviously around some of these things. There are certain areas where it's relatively low risk, and other areas where it looks like it's a lot more, there's a lot more thought that happen with it, or a lot more guardrails needed around it.
Great. So I'm just going to, there's lots of great questions, and I'm having to just look over to my other screen to keep an eye on them as they come in. So Patrick from Microsoft. So Patrick, thanks for sharing the fact that you're working with Microsoft. Is asking, I'm interested to hear from you about corporate buyer demand and use cases for immersive technologies. How's that kind of changed over the recent times in terms of recent grids?
So a story comes to mind. Going back a few years, I think if you're talking immersive technologies, the VR, the AR side of things, then I know I was a little bit skeptical about whether that was more hype. I mean, if you go to an exhibition and there's anybody there with you know, the VR glasses, then there's a queue to have a look at that. But how well is that, or how, you know, much is it being used in an organization, in a corporate? And actually, one of the reference calls that I had was with a manufacturing company, and they, during the pandemic, had from a supplier of VR, they got a good relationship with them, and the cost was coming down for the VR. They engaged them for 10 modules, 10 courses. And I said, okay, that sounds great. Are you going to continue? Because I wondered whether that once they tried it, that would then, whether or not it would work or not. And he said, oh no, this actually works for us, and we're going to continue. And so I think in very specific areas, I think that immersive technology is going to be important. I think, and one of the questions that I was asking was, so what are you tracking? Because I think this is important from a learning systems perspective. Is it's all right just launching a course and then maybe completing it, but you probably want to know what went on inside that VR course. And I think sometimes, I mean, the SCORM tracking is not going to help. And so there needs to be some way of doing that. XAPI is one way. There are other more proprietary things that the potential, but in fact, that particular individual's learning system were able to work with them, and they did go down the XAPI route, and were starting to look at what they were going to track. Because that's the other thing. Yes, they can now track, but it's kind of trying to think out of the box. What will we track?
If I just add a couple of things to that. I mean, one of the things in the past when we've looked at this is, I think we've seen a lot of potential around augmented reality type stuff, AR, and the potential for using that within a workplace context is a lot more obvious, I think, and a lot more context. And it's surprising in some ways that we haven't seen more acceleration of AR within a corporate strategy, really. It's still pretty much a niche thing. I think the VR, or the whole kind of metaverse thing and the investment around that, I mean, obviously certain companies, not least Facebook/Meta, have obviously invested billions in there, and as do, I'm sure, a lot of the mainstream end, probably including Microsoft. But you know, I think at the moment that's not really impacted the psyche of the majority of corporate learning teams. Particularly, they don't really understand where it is, and I mean, sometimes where they've piloted stuff, it hasn't really been particularly successful. I do think there's an inevitable growth, though, that we will see over time. But potentially, I think there's a lot of immediate potential around the AR side of things that hasn't really been done. The other thing I was going to do is pick up, obviously, it was Patrick who asked the question. So that was Mr. Seattle from the, strangely enough, given the Microsoft thing, picking up on what Fiona said about Microsoft in there. So, you know, this is not the first 9 group we've started to add Microsoft in, and not because of its, you know, like an HR, because of its dynamics and stuff like this, but just because of the way that it is trying to really bring things around, whether that's learning experience or employee experience, etc., in the wider HR context, into the workplace via the workplace apps in particular teams. And I think what's interesting there is, you know, to some degree, it's unclear necessarily what its full intent is or what its full capability is. I mean, Microsoft has sometimes promised to do things or indicated it's going to do them in the past, and it's not really been successful in HR and talent and learning, or not in the way that I think some of the corporates expected to. But pretty clearly, I think if you're a corporate, an Office 365 customer or an Office customer, and you're using Teams, then it's pretty hard to ignore what's going on there. And from a vendor, it's pretty hard to ignore it as well, because almost one of the last things you want to do is not be included in that world if it starts to take off. So it is having a big impact on the way corporates are looking at the problem, although yet as necessarily to materialize in terms of what their deployed strategy is. So it's very much early stages, but obviously with pretty strong and clear intent from Microsoft's and investment and acquisitions and other things to really, I think, have a big impact there. And all the big learning system vendors are basically, trying to ensure they're included in that universe.
Interesting. So Patrick, I hope that you got a bit more for your money there. So we got some Microsoft insights as well as touching on those other areas. So Ian, next question. Ian he's asking, with more focus on holistic HR areas like skills, talent, and employee experience, and the difficulty or slowness to adopt true integration between products, do you see there being a bigger movement towards suites that cover full HR as well as learning? If you'd like to answer that.
Well, there clearly has been from the HR side, right, already. I mean, this is not a new game. Workday and SAP, particularly with SuccessFactors, have been very assertive around that story for a number of years. Oracle, the Oracle HCM Cloud also, with learning components in as well. So this is in some ways an old debate. I mean, what's interesting is it's kind of funny when you go back to it and talk about suite versus best of breed versus maybe app, type thinking. Almost every level thinks they've won that battle. And the answer is it's because pretty much everything, all of those things are happening. So the HCM suites have increased their presence within the learning systems buyer market. That's why they're all in strategic challenger, but they're actually not, as for in our view, strategic leaders yet, right? Often what happens, though, is that organizations look at specialists alongside those suite components in order to create either a true industrial strength or a disruptive proposition. So in some ways, it's about ecosystem. And if you read the report last year, we talked a lot about ecosystem, not system. And one of the key characteristics, which we also mentioned in the report this year, is around ecosystemness. The ability to plug and play across the ecosystem is really critical. Skills is a very, really interesting question because, although L&D sort of thinks it owns the skills questions from a, particularly from skilling and upskilling, reskilling type angle, the reality is actually the skills technology agenda has been more driven from HR and recruiting probably than it has been from L&D. And part of the problem is we have a slide that we often use where we talk about this and saying, basically everybody's trying to own it, but nobody really wants to share or play nice. And that's started to change. Companies have realized if you're a Workday customer running Skills Cloud, that you need to plug that together with skills technologies around, and solutions like Eightfold and so on, and then, or plug it together with what you're doing in Cornerstone with ultimately a skills engine from Clustery. How those things fit together is a really critical issue. I mean, at the end of the day, I think a lot of these solutions are used to playing in the ecosystem. And actually, as we've moved to the cloud, that has got easier generally. And we do certainly talk about this ecosystemness, the ability to play in an ecosystem as a significant differentiated capability. But ultimately, it's an area that all the vendors are really trying to do and build marketplaces and build connectors so that you can just plug in and press a button and these things then work. But at the end of the day, so come back to the original question, HCM suites, I don't think will dominate learning on their own. They will be customers that decide that is a best strategy for them. A lot of organizations have kind of considered that or have got a dual strategy, sometimes using other learning specialist applications or learning suites around that as well. Also depends, you know, if you're in a, for example, a validated environment, such as a pharma or a life sciences company, you know, your HR system doesn't have to be validated, but the learning systems does, right? So, because for regulatory compliance, so there's a lot of other factors around it. It's a complex landscape. The interesting things from Fosway is, you know, because we look at the HR side of it and the talent side and the recruiting side and the learning side, we're looking at it from every angle.
Yeah, great. Fiona, would you add anything there?
It's only that, you know, in the mid-market, many of the buyers only can afford one system, and so you do have a number of the there's Access bought Unicorn some years ago, and also you have Calidus that are building out, bought is it Sapling, and so you know, there is at the, not just at the higher level, but at the mid-market and the lower levels, there is that extending out of the suite, so that, you know, the mid-market players can only need to be focusing on one vendor.
Great.
The other piece is, of course, extended. As soon as you put extended enterprise in the mix, that changes the equation, because those people aren't in your HR system. Yeah, so if you, and that's also the other dynamic then. So the other interesting question is, if you're doing a lot of learning internally and now you're trying to up the game externally, is that a separate universe, or is that a joined up universe to your internal? And obviously the moment you focus on trying to serve external audiences or external and internal audiences, you're not going to do that within an HR system. So that kind of dynamic also comes into play. And there's no doubt that, you know, I would argue the highest value learning we can probably do around an enterprise is around the extended enterprise, right? It's not just around, you know, what you do with your staff internally is really critical, but ultimately you're having, you know, highly proficient and effective customers, partners, and everything else. The whole supply chain that surrounds you is probably even more disproportionately important. So I think this is an area where we expect to see growth, and I think that creates another kind of a bit of conflict of interest in some ways behind the march of the HCM platform as the dominant system for learning.
Okay. So Ian, we started off saying that it's not a new debate, but actually there's plenty to say about it, and it's ongoing. So thank you for that question. Now I'm going to quickly, I'm not doing this in a sort of chronological order. I'm going to just skip quickly to, we talked about skills. So I just wanted to ask a question from Alexander. He's talking about how do you see learning in conjunction with skills-driven development? How is all this working together? You'd like to answer that?
I suppose, as I mentioned, the skills piece goes right across the all our practices within the analyst organization. But for learning, that's where the actual skilling and upskilling happens. And I'm not sure we've necessarily had everybody's got their arms around it and defined it. And there is it's a combination of, do we you know, are you tagging everything that you're learning? Is there practice that's got to come into that for the skilling piece? So I think there's still a lot of work to do on that. And I think we've maybe been focusing on those skills engines, the taxonomies and etc., just to kind of define what profiles the learner has, rather than necessarily that the feedback that needs to come from that upskilling and reskilling, to make sure that they are improving and increasing their capabilities. And also there's the area of the reporting and knowing what skills you have in an organization. So I think there's a lot going on in lots of different, there's lots of moving parts, I suppose, and I'm not sure that we've necessarily got a final answer. David, you're going to be able to give a lot better because you see across the whole of the piece across all analysts.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of interesting additions on that. I mean, first of all, the mid-market players have generally been pretty slow to engage with the skills debate, right? So if anything, it's been driven more from larger enterprise solutions and specialists. And so, you know, Cornerstone's had a really strong strategy around skills for a long time, you know, having acquired, I say, Clustery, which is a French-based AI engine that was doing a lot of really interesting work around that. You know, Workday, obviously with Skills Cloud, again, many years of doing that, and obviously looking at their AI investments around those things. Degreed, which sort of morphed away from sort of its original sort of LXP positioning towards becoming really a skills development and certification type platform as well, etc. So, you know, I think the larger enterprise players are doing it, but what we've definitely seen is infecting the mid-market as well. And it needs to as well, because linked skills, as we talk about it sometimes as the fuel for talent, and it's certainly the language for describing it. And at the moment, there's significant growth there. The challenge is that a lot of that's being driven from other parts of the HR stack, and less from learning, even though you'd think it was. The other thing I would also slightly counter a little bit what Fiona said about really it's learning where skills are built, right? Where, you know, the reskilling, upskilling is, that's partly true, except that boundary is porous. A good example of that is with looking at things like talent mobility and opportunity marketplaces. So again, one of the things that we would argue quite strongly is the best ways to build proven skills is to have the opportunity to work on stuff, right? And that's really interesting when you start looking at, and again, coming back, I referenced Cornerstone came out with a new label. I don't particularly like the talent experience label particularly, but they talk about in their architecture model, the top layer is being around something, might be, it's not quite right, but people growth experience. And within there, they've put the Edcast LXP-like functionality, but they've also put their opportunity marketplace in that as well. And looking at building out, you know, so effectively to develop, all of this is to do with development, yeah. In order to develop and build skills and capability, you need to be able to learn stuff and apply it, right? And then I think it's being able to do those things together. And again, this is where it becomes interesting, because obviously we're seeing a lot of the opportunity map come from other angles, from HCM, from recruiting, for example. A lot of those are building talent mobility systems, looking at where people are coming as well. So again, skills is typically the language that underpins it. The question is, whose view of skills? Where does that come from? How is that built? Is that a generic library? Is that a generic AI process, or is it specific to your organization? And typically different parts of the stack have a different view of the answer to that, and they don't join up particularly well. That's starting to change, but actually I would argue in most cases, other than maybe a couple of the learning vendors, they're not we're playing catch up here in learning systems versus what's sometimes going on in some of the other parts of our, you know, HR and talent portfolio.
Great. So I think Pete has just, as I said, I'm not doing this 100% chronologically, and bear with me. I'm going to try and get through the questions, and we will answer any that we don't answer here now. So you'll absolutely get answers to your questions. But Pete, the LXP was very fashionable learning experience platform. Pete's saying most have dropped the moniker. Have you got any comments on that?
Pete, I noticed that you're from Bury, I think. I don't know whether that's up north where I am or whether it's the Bury St Edmunds, but thanks for this question. Because we've always said over the years that the LXP label doesn't really describe in enough of a way, either from a vendor perspective, what they are capable of doing, or even from a buyer perspective and what they are wanting. So what's happened sort of from a grid perspective over the last few years is that because we did this research that I mentioned earlier, which is why we came up with the model, that 5 kind of pillared model on the specialists to deconstruct what the LXP that experience might mean, and so we have also, and so we, there were things like programmatic, and there was collaborative, there was mobile, there's intelligence, there's a whole load of things that could have actually been part of. And back in probably 3 or 4 years ago, when we had a specialist on the grid, we would name it that it was either programmatic specialist or a collaborative or whatever. And particularly those that are in the mid-market very quickly began to realize that as the buyers had almost assumed that they were going to be able to do the learning management piece anyway, they were having to backfill with that learning management piece and not staying as the specialist. So quite a number of the specialists that were from a few years ago are now suites on the grid. And that kind of sort of in a way explains that the LXP label does not work. It does not, and as you rightly say, everybody is moving away from it. And yeah, because it never did kind of describe. It was a great, people thinking, oh, because the LMS had got a bad sort of rap, if you like, from being legacy. It's the old stuff, and therefore going for an LXP sounded as though you were going for something that was new, and it was whatever. All the LMSs needed to do was put a layer, or basically update what they were doing in the various areas that were needed, and that's what they've been doing. And so, yeah, we now don't tend to talk about LMS. We don't talk about LXP. We talked about learning systems, and we talk about suites and specialists within that.
And we made that call 3 years ago, so that's not new. Yeah. And apparently there's a berry in Quebec, by the way, just in case we wanted to wonder if there was any other one. But the key thing here is that architecturally it never really made sense, right? So there was a role that it could play, particularly in large enterprise, where fixing their LMS and making them solve be much more attractive from a learner perspective was a tough gig. So adding extra components on did make sense, and obviously being able to pull stuff from other places. But we actually made that call 3 years ago, and said that ultimately we didn't see that as being sustained, not least because all the LMS companies wouldn't obviously allow themselves to be cut off from the learner. They would all have to raise the game and build their Netflix and interface and their personalized AI-based recommendations and all those kinds of things as well. And that's exactly what's happened. And now, Degreed and Edcast were probably the poster child players for the LXP market. Obviously, Edcast has now been bought by Cornerstone, and that offering still exists, right? There's still and there will still obviously service Edcast customers that aren't Cornerstone customers or aren't Cornerstone LMS customers. But at the end of the day, this was only ever a temporary kind of piece of the story. And in the mid-market, as Fiona said earlier, nobody can afford to buy multiple solutions and be able to pay to integrate them together, right? Which is also the other big problem. So it was always inevitable that either LXP companies would backfill LMS and become suites, or the other way around. And that's exactly what's happened.
Great. So we've still got a few questions, and we're down to, we do try and keep it to time. So we've got 6 or 7 minutes. Just quickly, Alexandros is just asking about, there's a lot of buzz around experience, but what about tools that offer insights on efficiency of learning outcomes? These harder data points, impact. What's happening there?
Yeah, hi, Alex. So that is a space that's really interesting, not least because I think we have a data point from our digital learning realities research that showed that basically half of learning L&D organizations are getting under more pressure to show value, to show more value and impact and more value add. It's one of the perennial problems within the L&D world is around the ability to show what impact they have, and to be able to, particularly to be able to build any kind of proper financial case around that. I think the focus really is around more about the immediacy of impact and bringing the right kind of relevant learning to the learner at the relevant point in time, etc. There are specialists within the within the learning world that, you know, focus on that kind of measurement of impact and being able to sort of look at that, and also some of that gets built into the people analytics layer as well. Being able to show correlation and or causation between investment in learning activity and outcomes like changing performance. For us, if you've ever heard us speak, you know, particularly David or I talking about David Perring or I talking about any of the things to do with the future strategy, one of the things you'll hear us always talk about is what really drives outcome, and ultimately how does this drive, you know, improve the performance or the business, the agility of the business. How does it enable the, you know, we've fixated a lot on the experience story, maybe at the expense of that. It's kind of interesting as you move into recessionary climates and so on, how maybe that balance swings back a little bit. So what's in it for the company as well as what's in it for the individual. But the reality is this is an and answer, right? We want both of those things. Some of the learning systems are better at being able to look at efficiency and effectiveness of learning outcomes, but actually a lot of them aren't any better than, you know, they're just a management system for managing a transaction and then maybe getting a happy sheet to see how good it is. So this is an area I think where there needs to be a lot more focus, and I also expect to see more R&D, but also more acquisitions, more niche players that come into this space, because it's still very under I think invested.
Right, Fiona.
Oh, I was just going to say that I was surprised when I did a little bit of investigation into the extended enterprise piece, where, you know, as David said, that is so important that there should be, that's where the in theory the impact should be seen, but it's not been measured as much as I would have expected, even though in a sense that's the easiest place to do the measurement, because, you know, you're either measuring maybe the number of products sold or the customer advocacy. You know, there are metrics there, but it's not been drawn in to, if somebody had done this piece of learning, that they ended up being able to sell more or whatever. So I think there is sometimes from a buyer's perspective, there's a lot more intentionality that needs to be brought into this. I think there is capability in some of the vendors to be able to deliver, but I think it really is on the buyers to kind of push through and find, you know, those areas where impact can be measured so that they can add value, show that they add value to the C-suite when it comes to budget cuts. As David said, this is, you know, an area that absolutely is needs to be focused on just now.
And I think that's, I know you're going to put the slide back on, but I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's a critical point in that extended enterprise situation. It's much, the focus on performance and outcome is much more explicit. And I think to some degree internally within learning, we tend to struggle with how, you know, with how to do that, and to some degree back away sometimes from the importance of doing it more. And, you know, because at the end of the day, you can have as efficient learning as you want. If it doesn't make anybody learn or do their job better, then why are you doing it at all? So I think there's some fundamentals there, but in the extended enterprise space, it's pretty explicit. It's there to drive more sales. It's there to drive better customer sat. It's there to drive, you know, better on the job performance. It's very explicit, I think. So.
Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes left. So all I wanted to say is we'll stop the questions there. Ricardo, Ian, Benjamin, Michelle, there are questions there that we will answer. So we'll basically take that offline. We'll ask the analysts and we can send you a written response to those questions. So we will answer those. And we're now going to try and get to 4 o'clock and not go beyond it. So just to wrap up, for those of you who are less familiar with Fosway, some of the stats on this slide are based on our 25+ years of working with corporates. So, you know, our experience is that less than 50% of corporate buyers are happy with their HR learning technology buying decisions. So that does feed into why we do what we do. We have this very lengthy process that the analyst team, they all have their domains and their expertise, and this unique research enables us to help corporates. So if that's you and you are interested in that, then please do get in touch through the website. And our work tends to cut that vendor research process, which can be very, very lengthy, by about 70%. So that's a bit about what we do. And if that's of interest, then please do get in touch. Our first of our 3 realities research programs is now open. So if you could do our digital learning realities research, and that would be absolutely fantastic. The link's in the chat. You can get it off the QR code, and that gives us just a lot of deep insight into where people are at with their digital learning strategies, approaches. And if you want to read the whole report in French, English or German, the 9-grid report for learning systems, the link is there. So I think I've managed to get through to, and it's 4 o'clock on the dot. So it goes without saying, a big thanks to Fiona and David today. Thanks to Jack in the background and Ian, and also, of course, a big thank you to everyone who's been here today with some great questions, very international audience. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.